to, take from, don't turn aside to the right hand or left, and so we just sing. And I also showed you in our first study that history tells us that instruments of music were not used. They were introduced many years after the time of Jesus and the apostles. When they were introduced, they were opposed. They have been opposed by such religious scholars and leaders as John Calvin and Martin Luther and others. Well, last Sunday we began to look at a couple of the arguments that have been made down through the years in an effort to justify the use of instruments of music. It has been argued that they were used in the Old Testament. But I pointed out last week that David used instrumental music in worship because God commanded him to do that. But the Old Testament law that authorized their use has been replaced by the gospel of Christ. And the New Testament only authorizes us to sing. But we also looked at another argument that's made from the book of Revelation. Folks will point out to us that there are harps in heaven. But I asked the question, why should we believe that these are literal harps in a highly symbolic book like the book of Revelation? I pointed out that if the golden bowls full of incense that we read about in chapter 5, verse 8, represent the prayers of the saints, why wouldn't these harps be symbolic for the praise of the saints? And if the fact that harps are used in heaven authorizes instrumental music here on earth today, do the golden bowls full of incense authorize the burning of incense in worship here on earth? And then we asked the question, did John hear a harp or a voice? When you look carefully at Revelation chapter 14, it becomes obvious, I think, that what John heard was a voice that sounded like harpers harping with their harps. But then we also asked the question, if harps are authorized by these passages, why do most churches today use nearly everything but harps? And we asked the question, since all of the victorious had harps in Revelation chapter 15, shouldn't every Christian play a harp in worship today? Those who make this argument will not accept that consequence. But then we also ask, even if there really are literal harps in heaven, does that prove that it's okay to use instruments of music in worship here on earth today? I pointed out that God's will for heaven is not necessarily the same as His will for earth. And then we asked the question, if these passages prove that instrumental music is acceptable to God, why didn't the early church understand that? Why didn't they use musical instruments? Well, we want to look at some other arguments this morning, and we're going to look at as many as we can in the time that we have, and then I'll conclude this particular study. Now, I'm not going to be able to look at every argument that has been made down through the years, and there are several arguments that we'll not talk about, but I'm trying to talk about what I believe are the strongest arguments for this practice. Well, another argument that is made is that God doesn't prohibit instrumental music in worship today. God doesn't condemn the practice, and some ask, well, if that's the case, who are we to condemn it? And the idea is that if the Bible doesn't say we can't, then we can. But please notice that there are several things, while it is true that there is no specific passage that says, thou shalt not use a piano. There are several things that God does say. He doesn't say we can't, but He does say that we're to do everything that we do in word or deed in the name of the Lord, by the authority of the Lord, with His approval. God does say that we are to test all things and hold fast that which is good. And God says in the New Testament that we're to sing. And as I've already mentioned, God said, don't tamper with my word. So you see, we've got to respect these other things that God has said in His word. We need to understand that when God specifies something, He doesn't have to specifically exclude everything else. When God told Noah to build an ark of gopher wood, He didn't have to say, no, I don't want hickory or ash or oak. When God specified gopher wood, that's what He wanted. That's what He expected Noah to use. When God specified a lamb without blemish for the Passover, He didn't say, now I don't want a bull or a chicken. When God specified a red heifer, He didn't have to say, now I don't want a white chicken. When God specified a brazen serpent that the Israelites were to look upon to be saved from snake bite, He didn't have to say, well, I don't want all these other things. And when God says sing, He doesn't have to specifically say, now I don't want musical instruments. We have noted in other studies that when the faithful among God's people were confronted with situations where they had not received instruction from God, they didn't do anything until they received instruction from God. Numbers chapter 9, there were those who were unable to partake of the Passover a year after they left Egypt because they were ceremonially unclean. They came to Moses. They wanted to partake of the Passover. And basically Moses said, wait, let me go talk to the Lord about this. He did, and the Lord made provisions for what we might call a make-up Passover. When God says nothing, the faithful do nothing until they get instruction from God. And we have noted in other studies, and my laptop has just locked up. This is not good. That God has punished presumption on the part of His people. He punished Nadab and Abihu because they presumed to offer strange fire that He had not commanded. But then I would also ask the question, where does God say, thou shalt not use buttermilk and cornbread for the Lord's Supper? You like buttermilk and cornbread? I'm not crazy about buttermilk, but I kind of like cornbread. Where has God said, don't use buttermilk and cornbread? Where has God said, don't add a lamb to the Lord's Supper? After all, Jesus was observing the Passover when He instituted the Lord's Supper. Where has God said, don't add a lamb? Do you know that some in churches of Christ are now observing the Lord's Supper in the midst of a common meal? That is going on. Where has God said don't count rosary beads or pray to Mary or burn incense or baptize infants? Nowhere has God said don't baptize infants. But the fact of the matter is the New Testament teaches that it is penitent believers who are the proper subjects for baptism. The proper question for us to ask is not, where does God exclude playing instruments? The proper question for us to ask is, where does God include playing instruments in the New Testament? It is important that we see that. Now, there is another argument that has been offered down through the years, and that is that the Greek word solo, that is translated make melody in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 19, requires playing. Paul told the Ephesians in Ephesians 5 that they were to be speaking to one another in psalms, that's the Greek word psalmos, and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody, that's the Greek word solo, in your heart to the Lord. A similar statement is found in Colossians 3:16. Well, here's the argument as O.E. Payne presented it. Henceforth, we must unite in agreeing that if we forego musical instruments, we cannot conform to the divine injunction to psalene. Do you understand the argument? He is arguing that the idea of instrumental music is inherent in the definition of these Greek words. Have you heard of this argument before? Some of you are shaking your head no. Well, I'm glad we're talking about this. Well, here is my response to this argument. And here's the skeleton of my response, and we'll hang some flesh on these bones momentarily. The fact of the matter is that the meaning of the Greek word solo changed over time. And many scholars maintain that in the New Testament times, solo merely meant to sing. I would also point out that the early church did not understand that solo included instrumental accompaniment because they didn't use the instruments, as we established in our first study. The Greek Orthodox Church did not understand that this Greek word includes the idea of instrumental accompaniment. Don't you suppose that if anybody knew what the Greek language meant, it would be somebody in the Greek Orthodox Church? Furthermore, no standard English translation indicates that solo included the idea of instrumental accompaniment in New Testament times. No principal modern translation like Weymouth, Moffat, Goodspeed, some others, indicates that this word includes the idea of an instrumental accompaniment. But this is vitally important for us to see. The instrument upon which we are to make melody, solo, is the heart, not the harp. In Ephesians 5:19, Paul says that we are to be making melody in or with our heart. Now let's look at some definitions quickly. Bedag, Bauer, Danker, Art, and Gingrich, the standard Greek English lexicon, does have this to say about this Greek word in our literature, in accordance with Old Testament usage, to sing songs of praise with or without instrumental accompaniment, sing, praise. But if you'll drop down, notice what they say a little bit later. The original meaning of solo was pluck, play, a stringed instrument. This persisted at least to the time of Lucian. Lucian lived in the 2nd century A.D. They go on to say in the Septuagint, solo frequently means sing, whether to the accompaniment of an instrument or not. Now notice this, as is usually the case. They go on to say this focus on singing continued until solo in modern Greek means sing exclusively. And then they tell us those who favor play may be relying too much on the earliest meaning of solo. Now, I think most of you remember that the New Testament was written in Koine Greek. There were various periods in which the Greek language has been categorized. The classical period was earlier than the period of Koine Greek, and Liddell and Scott in their lexicon are really dealing with the language in this earlier period. And so they define the word pluck, pull, twitch, pluck the hair, especially of the bowstring, send a shaft twanging from the bow, a carpenter's red line which is twitched and then suddenly let go so as to leave a mark. Now, do you see what they're saying? They're saying that this word solo was used early on to talk plucking a hair, plucking the strings of a bow, plucking a carpenter's line. But they tell us that in the Christian period, this word meant sing psalms. Word meanings change. What is the meaning of the English word lyric? I'm going to pick on Mark. Mark, what does that word mean? He wasn't expecting this. The words to a song. How many would say the same thing that Mark just said? The word lyric means the words of a song. That's exactly what I would say. What about the English word gay? That has changed meaning, has it not? In our lifetime. There's an old Fred Astaire movie, saying this for the benefit of Mark, called The Gay Divorcee. Now that was way back yonder. I mean, Mark thinks an old movie is a movie in the 80s. This was probably 30s or 40s. That's what I think of as old movies. Well, I assure you that that title, The Gay Divorcee, did not mean then what it would mean now. You with me? You understand what I'm saying? The same thing has occurred with the Greek word solo. It changed its meaning over time. Early on, it meant to pluck anything, and then it came to mean to play a stringed instrument. Then it came to mean to sing to a harp, and now in modern Greek, it meant to sing exclusively. Mark said the word lyric refers to the words of a song, but that was not its original meaning. James DeBale points out, lyric first meant of or for a lyre, a song sung to the accompaniment of a lyre, and then poetry delineating the poet's own thoughts and feelings. He goes on to say, today it refers to the words of a song without any idea of an instrument. You see, that word changed its meaning over time, and that's what happened with the Greek word solo. Roberson says it is obvious from the evidence that the basic meaning of the verb and noun does not involve music as such. Rather, the general significance of touch or strike stands out as the root or proper meaning, irrespective of the particular object. M.C. Curfeys said, again, let it be noted that no particular object inheres in the original meaning of the term to the exclusion of other objects. The word merely meant to pluck off, pull out, to cause to vibrate by touching, to twang, regardless of the object that one might pluck off, pull out, cause to vibrate by touching or twang. A.T. Robertson, a recognized Greek scholar, says the word originally meant to play on a stringed instrument, but it comes to be used also for singing with the voice and heart, making melody with the heart also to the Lord. Another Greek scholar by the name of Marvin R. Vincent said a psalm was originally a song accompanied by a stringed instrument. See on 1 Corinthians 14:15, the idea of accompaniment passed away in usage. J.W. McGarvey, pioneer preacher, says, and if any man who is a preacher believes that the apostle teaches the use of instrumental music in the church by enjoining the singing of psalms, he is one of those smatterers in Greek who can believe anything that he wishes to believe. When the wish is father to the thought, correct exegesis is like water on a duck's back. F.F. Bruce, recognized scholar who died some years ago, I don't remember now when. He says the word psalene and psalmos in the New Testament do not then in themselves afford evidence of the use of instruments of music in worship. But may I suggest to you that those who make this argument will not accept the logical consequences of the argument. You see, if the idea of musical instruments is inherent in the meaning of this word, that means instrumental music is not optional but obligatory. And they don't believe that. More than that, it means the harp, or at least another stringed instrument, is obligatory. And it would mean that all Christians must play the harp because all Christians are commanded to make melody. You see, what proves too much proves nothing at all. Well, let me quickly try to address one more point in the limited time that I have remaining. It is argued that instrumental music is just an aid to singing. And an aid is just a means to an end. We might think of an aid as a tool to help us accomplish something. And if the end that we're trying to accomplish is authorized, then aids to accomplish that end are justified. God told Noah to build an ark. Now, do you suppose Noah used any tools to accomplish that? Well, the answer is obvious, isn't it? God didn't specify anything about using tools in his instructions, but we all understand that Noah must have used tools to accomplish that, and they were authorized by God's instructions to build an ark. God told Abraham to offer Isaac, and I'll show you momentarily that Abraham used various things to accomplish that. But we must never forget that we cannot add to what God has instructed us to do with any of our so-called aids. God told Abraham to offer Isaac, and when we read the account, we find that Abraham used a donkey, he took wood and fire and a knife, and he built an altar. None of those things were specifically mentioned by God, but they were all authorized by what God told Abraham to do. When the Lord authorizes an act to be performed, whatever is essential or expedient to carry out that act is authorized by the Lord's instruction. So when God said, make an ark, was authorized for Noah to use tools, to use work animals to get the timbers to the building site. But if Noah had built a sailboat or a tower, that would have been an addition. Are you with me? You all see this? Skipping down to the bottom of this chart, God told Moses to build a brazen serpent and put it on a pole. Well, that authorized tools to make that brazen serpent. But we find out later on in 2 Kings 18 that the Israelites had been burning incense to that brazen altar for years, or brazen serpent for years. That wasn't authorized. That was an addition. Christians are authorized to observe the Lord's Supper, and cups and plates and a table. Those are aids to help us do that. But if we add a lamb, or if we turn the Lord's Supper into a social meal, we have added something that God did not authorize. God instructs us to give on the first day of the week. Baskets or a box like we have back there on the table are aids or tools to help us do that. But if we start selling raffle tickets, or we have chili suppers or cakewalks to raise money, we've added something to God's instructions, right? And when God tells us to sing, a songbook, a song leader, a pitch pipe, or aids or tools to help us accomplish what God instructs us to do. But when we add a piano or a guitar or an organ, we have added another kind of music. We've added something to what God tells us to do. Hopefully I can illustrate my point like this. Let's suppose that you have the opportunity to listen to 3 different audio recordings. And in these recordings, you've got a group of people singing the hymn, Amazing Grace. All right? And in the first audio recording, they are singing this hymn from memory. In the second audio recording, they are singing this hymn using a songbook. And in the third audio recording, they are singing a hymn with an instrument. Now let me ask you the question. If you have listened to these recordings, could you tell the difference from the audio recording alone between number 1 and number 2? You couldn't, could you? Assuming that when they were singing from memory, they knew the words and they weren't stumbling over them, okay? No, you couldn't tell the difference. Why not? Because they're just singing. Now, could you tell the difference between number 2 and number 3? You could, couldn't you? Why? Because in number 3, they're not just singing. Do you see my point? They have added a different kind of music. But somebody says, well, no, wait a minute, Kevin. I don't sing very well. A piano would help me sing better. Okay, well, what about this? I don't like the taste of unleavened bread. A little grape jelly would help me get it down easier. Is that going to work? I might change that to blackberry jelly. You were supposed to smile. Folks, come back here. The jam is parallel to the cup and the plates. Well, that's the argument, I mean. Somebody says, well, if the preacher can use a laptop computer to help him preach better, why can't we use a piano to help us sing better? Now, how would you respond to that? what would you say? You see, I'm trying to equip the saints here. Well, here's what I would say. The laptop computer is parallel to the plate and the cup, but the piano is parallel to the jam. Do you see my point? Well, there's more that I could say, but I'm out of time. And if you have some questions that you'd like to ask me, I'd be more than willing to talk with you privately. But I think we've encompassed this mountain long enough for this time. Again, there are other arguments that have been made. I've tried to address what I believe are the strongest arguments. I believe that these arguments, if I can borrow the words in Daniel, that these arguments have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Thank you.